Okay, I'll throw it open to questions. If people can just identify who they are so we have it on camera and then perhaps come to the microphone. Yes. Scott, can we just get... Yep, it should be working now.
This is Moore from South Metro. Two very interesting talks, thank you both. The meaning for the patient, I think, is always very important. I can attest to the difficulties in the American system, having lived there for some time, and it is something, I think, around self-interest from the insurance company's perspective. But my real question is really around the social determinants. I was reading the National Geographic the other week and surprised to see that there are something like 10 million Americans who are food insecure in a country as affluent as America. And what does that have in terms of the rates of anxiety and depression? And really, what role is there for psychiatry in actually just getting back to those basics? How much of a role do we have in the social determinants, both in the US, the UK, and also in Australia?
It's yours. Well, without going on too long about this, I work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a city that, until about 1980, was a major industrial site for the production of steel. You might be interested to know that Pittsburgh produced half of the steel used by the Allies during World War II. So it was a very, very significant place and took a lot of pride in that. And then the steels industry basically bellied up as it went elsewhere, and technological advances meant that you didn't have to have large numbers of people making steel. So we have had a dramatic change in the economy of the United States, and we have had, unfortunately, I guess I'll have to use the term a neoliberal approach to that, which has been one that does not support or focus on any kind of social solidarity, which means we don't have a welfare system, okay? So what do we do about that? What does a psychiatrist do about that? And I guess the best I've gotten to in this, and there's a lot more to say about it, but I'll try to keep it very brief, is that the one thing I think we have a capacity to do that other entities don't, or other people don't necessarily, is to figure out how to help people have conversations across a wide range of social settings and circumstances about the problems that a society is having. So in Pittsburgh, in the face of what I've just talked about, I have taken on a role as sort of on my own as a psychiatrist to try to orchestrate conversations between the African American community, between the business community, between labor, between the religious communities, to highlight the dilemma we have in our own patch of not paying attention to each other. And that, I have to say, is a real hard struggle. And I would love to have more psychiatrists engaged in it. But it is one of the things I think we have a unique capacity to do.
Pat, did you want to make any comments?
Well, I'd agree with that, and I think this is what I mean about kind of redefining our role away from this kind of notion that our job is purely diagnosing and treating, faulty brain processes. What we're really good at, I think, and what draws a lot of us to this work is that those negotiation skills, that toleration of ambiguity, as I've mentioned already. And I think when you see good psychiatry in practice, it's something wonderful. In my own service, because the Irish economy has gone down the tubes in the last number of years, where I live and work was largely dependent on the construction industry, like a large part of the country, and that suddenly went from being, boom time to nothing very quickly, and so you had a lot of young families in great despair, and our suicide rate became a kind of a national concern. Now, psychiatry can't solve that. It's not our job to pretend that we have instant solutions to that. But like Ken, one of the things we have done is to support communities. I see it as a legitimate part of my job as a clinical director in a service like ours, to actually go to communities to be part of the discussion that's happening there, because they're really concerned about suicide in their midst. So we've actually a whole program in where I work of working in villages and towns on that sort of discussion and that negotiation around that. And people value the experience that I bring. I don't come and say I've got all the answers. People don't expect that. But they do like to have doctors there. They do like to have people who knows what depression is like, know what the kind of struggles that people have as part of that discussion. And it's a different notion of the expertise of psychiatry. But to me, it's a very interesting and it's a kind of a opening up of a side of psychiatry that I think we've neglected. I mean, psychiatry has a very proud, long history of social psychiatry, which I think we've just forgotten about in the last number of years, that we need to go back to really re-engage with, to celebrate, and to make part of our work today.
If I could just say one other piece on this, that it turns out that we can actually help people recover. I mean, people can actually get to a place where they are ready to go back into the world. The biggest problem I keep running into is that there's a world that isn't ready to take them back. No jobs, no housing, no caring. So I really have seen the work being, how do we help folks? We're in relatively comfortable circumstances personally, all of us, I'm sure, in terms of our capacity to have an ecological setting. But the folks we're trying to be helpful to don't. And I don't know how we're going to do more of this, but I really do think figuring out how to create the understanding in society that housing and opportunities with jobs, education, family support will actually benefit the people and the society a lot better than purely doling out medication.
Nathan?
Thanks to you both. Pardon me, sorry, Nathan Gibson. Just a couple of comments about training psychiatrists. Certainly, as an examiner for the college, in recent years, I can actually honestly say I've never heard a candidate use the term recovery in any exams. And also, I think the other issue that I note, and perhaps I'm being a bit unfair, and formulation is a lifelong skill that we learn, but the ability to formulate in anything other than a highly psychodynamic and biological kind of framework, and not being able to incorporate and really integrate, I see as a struggle. And again, I think it's a lifelong skill that we have to do, but those kind of things worry me given the environment that we're in. And I just wondered if you wanted to comment on the training of psychiatrists and what that means for the future.
I just would agree with you 100%. I mean, when I was training way back, I mean, formulation was the centre of what you had to really take a history, get to know the person who was there in front of you, and the idea was that you didn't come up with a diagnosis, a kind of a single label that would somehow carry the meaning of that person's suffering, but you are expected in the time you had to pull all the through your interview skills, through your interpretation skills, through your making sense skills that I've talked about, to somehow put some kind of framework on it and help the person make sense of it. And I think we're in danger in the DSM era of neglecting that. I'm not saying that we have to go back to psychoanalysis and that's the route forward. Psychoanalysis, I think, had all sorts of problems with it. But at least at the heart of psychoanalysis, at Freud's project, was the idea that a lot of mental health problems, maybe not them all, but a lot of them did come from relationship difficulties. And that maybe the way of solving a lot of mental health problems was through relationship development as well. So I think, there is something very, very important from our history of psychoanalysis, and psychiatry, as I say, can go back to that. So I just agree with you that I think we have things in our history that I think we can re-engage with positively. I used the word hermeneutic there. There's a whole history of European psychiatry that engaged with these ideas back in the mid part of the 20th century. People like Medard Boss, a Swiss psychiatrist, who really wrote about hermeneutics and the whole of medicine, but particularly in psychiatry. I'm interested that people aren't talking about recovery, and the students aren't talking about recovery, and that's my experience in Ireland as well, that it doesn't seem to feature very largely in the curriculum of trainees in psychiatry, but everybody else is talking about it. It is the agenda that all the other stakeholders are wanting us to move in that direction. My own feeling is that some of what I've tried to outline in terms of what I would call the grip of the technological paradigm is holding us back from engaging properly with that. One of the jobs, as I see it, of critical psychiatry is not, as I say, to attack psychiatry, but to hopefully engage and get us engaged with that agenda that other people are wanting us to engage with.
A little contribution that I could make on this with maybe a slightly hopeful uptick is that on the very bad side, in the United States right now, I already mentioned that 50% are over the age of 55. It turns out another 50%, not necessarily just those over the age of 55, only take insurance. Oh, sorry, don't take insurance. Don't take insurance for payment, which means they require cash on the barrelhead, which means that you are taking care of a very particular population of people who can afford to pay that kind of money if you're going to be a well-heeled psychiatrist. So one of the areas we're really struggling with, and I kind of was alluding to this when I was talking about the workforce issue, is making sure that we have people who are committed in some way to public service, and the sacrifices that go with actually having to work hard and to take care of folks who have struggles and issues that can't be remediated by sliding a couple $100 into your pocket. The fascinating thing that's going on right now, and this is where the recovery paradigm is starting to show up and where we're starting to see some interest in trainees, is that trainees are aware that for all this fluff and all the hype about biological reductionist psychiatry, nothing's coming out. Just nothing's coming out at the back end. And then they're looking at all this energy and activity that's going in to redesigning healthcare and public policy for the first time in the United States, really starting to have, in some ways, some incredibly stupid arguments, but nonetheless, arguments that are, if they can be resolved in a positive sense, will have a very significant impact on the future of practice and the future of health and the future of healthcare in the United States. So they're sitting there in this environment and starting to see that that if they're not engaged in the social world and they try to go into this academic medical world, that they actually are taking themselves out of history. So now this isn't everybody. I don't want to by any means suggest that this blinder has been lifted for that many people, but we are now seeing fellowships and residency programs that are particularly focused on supporting psychiatrists who are interested in public service, and these things are actually growing across the country, despite the fact that the federal government to this day has not spent a dime on psychiatric education for over 40 years. Not a specific dime on public service psychiatry.
While Alan's walking there, I've never been to a meeting where Alan hasn't asked a question.
I'm just standing here as a gesture.
Good, then.
Because Aaron expected it.
I did.
Yeah. So what I wanted to mention was, first of all, that Ken is not just been a leader of community psychiatry in the States, but also he has been the Post-Industrial Society community psychiatrist par excellence, and he has taken a very passionate interest in post-industrial societies throughout the world and what to do about them, and you've had a sample of that. We had our own program here in Australia, and I don't know that people recall it much, but within the first 5 years, I think, of the National Mental Health Strategy, we had the integrated mental health program, which involved 2 post-industrial cities, Wollongong and a smaller town, Broken Hill, where I've been involved with the Aboriginal communities, and I wrote the proposal for that one. And then there was another one down in Melbourne. And these programs were, particularly in the more rural and regional areas, cashed out the private mental health funding from the Health Insurance Commission that wasn't spent on private care because there was no private practitioners, or very few, in those areas, and made sure that people attended to whole communities. And they talked about and operationalised the consultant role, the consultant psychiatrist role, so that we just didn't see people one-to-one after each other all the time, but got out there, and there was enough funding for psychiatrists and other interdisciplinary professionals to get out there and start working in what Kaplan would have called community psychiatry, getting out into your consultant role with Centrelink, with GPs, and doing assessments there, which would never come to the mental health service. They'd all be done in primary care, to Lifeline, to the other NGOs, and set up supervision relationships, which I think Kaplan had outlined in his books from Harvard. That was evaluated rigorously, and if you want the references, I can give them to you. It turned out to be a success, with the promise from the federal government that if it was a success, they would operationalise it. But of course, they forgot to operationalise it, and these programs lasted a couple of years, got evaluated, and then faded. Some of those communities have tried to keep aspects of them going, but they tried to work with whole communities, with all the organisations in the communities, and I think we're an attempt to work in the direction that both Pat and Ken have been talking about. So I think the issue is that we are experts in complexity, and we've demonstrated that with consultation liaison psychiatry, particularly, and shown how surgeons and physicians that they could take a wider view. And I think the urge in looking at comprehensive systems has always been to go wider and to look wider as to what the issues are. And I think we've had an example in the Open Dialogue folks coming to Australia earlier this year, Jaakko Sekalo and company, and showing us or reminding us that our family therapy training and our relationships training was very important, and that we used to have the funding in the community to do social systems interventions, which is a wider form of family intervention, which includes a wider community and a much more open system in solving your problems. My final issue, I think, is to ask Pat to expand a little bit on the connection between hermeneutics and epistemology. Considering that old adage that if you can grab people by their epistemologies, then their hearts and minds will follow.
Thanks, Alan. Pat, you only have to answer the question.
Well, I specifically raised it in this meeting. We've limited time. I'm expanding tomorrow the wider dimensions of the critical psychiatry project as I see it, which is a growing project with a number of dimensions to it. But epistemology is very important because it is. I think it has to do with how we understand ourselves, and particularly how we understand the nature of our expertise. As you were talking there, Alan, I was reminded one of the key kind of learning experiences for me as a trainee. I did a senior registrar placement in Birmingham in the UK in neuropsychiatry, actually, in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, where they were doing quite a lot of the neurologists and neurosurgeons, they were doing a lot of high-powered stuff on brain implants for Parkinson's, and there were some of the leading experts in the UK were in the department there. And I went there with great deal of trepidation as a young psychiatrist, thinking, oh my God, I'll have to learn up all about neuroanatomy and neurophysiology, etc., etc. And I'd go to case conferences with all these neuroradiologists and experts in various parts of the brain and the rest of it. And what I found actually, and I thought they'd find presence of psychiatry an irritant, or what do you guys know about any of this stuff? In fact, they relied on us very, very heavily, not to make diagnoses or anything like it, but the sort of problems that people were running into with long-term issues with multiple sclerosis, with Parkinson's disease, with other neurodegenerative disorders, these guys hadn't a clue how to deal with the family issues that were coming up there, how to negotiate what was going on with depression and sadness and all the rest of it. People with MS, facing life challenges. And that's what they wanted us to deal with. And yes, we needed medical knowledge. Yes, we needed to be part of that discussion. We needed our medical training, but we needed to bring something else to the table. And that is what I would call our interpretive skills. And that's what we need to get back to, I think, in psychiatry, rather than and aspire to someday where we will sit in an office and take a blood test to test someone's genetic factors and do a brain scan and identify them as a bipolar 1 or 2 based on some kind of, that's not the future of psychiatry, I don't think. And I think what draws a lot of us into it is, and we need to be proud of that and to build that notion, but to do that, we need to theorize our field properly, and not feel that we have to have the same kind of knowledge as urologists have or endocrinologists have. We have to be able to diagnose in exactly the same way. We don't. That's not what our field is about. We do need to take this notion that the word mental in front of the word illness signifies something important to us. So that's where I'd come back to the epistemology.
I just wanted to bring this home to Western Australia, and talk about the idea that, as I understand it, Western Australia is a place that's built on extractive industries that tend to be boom and bust. Tend to be boom and bust. And you are likely sitting in various moments when you have a lot of resources flowing into the society, into the people, and a lot of people moving here. And then you probably have periods of time when things go absolutely belly up. And I'm sure that there are various places where the strains and stresses on the ecology are pressing on human habitation and on social relations, either in the boom or the bust. And I would suggest to you that that is actually a field of psychiatry. That there are many societies that have been through this, and we know how people deal with this or don't deal with it. And it would be really helpful to start a conversation about how you all are thinking about where and how this society is going to deal with the way it has organized itself. Because if you start doing that, perhaps we can start helping some of the other places in the country and in other countries around the world that are having similar sorts of situations. And you, by the way, have more of the resources to figure out how to be helpful to places than probably most. So, so if I can leave you with that as a potential charge in a hermeneutic way, that there's some meaning in all the work that you do that would be helpful for the planet, maybe that's what I can do.
Okay. Look, I'd like to close this evening. Ken's touched on the extraction issues in Western Australia. I didn't brief him that 10% of the gross domestic product in Australia comes from a very small part of the Pilbara and is from iron ore. And it's extraordinary that a very small number of disenfranchised, marginalised Australians get nothing from the GDP that comes there, nor does any of that flow into effective healthcare systems. And for every $2 that the Commonwealth Government collects in GST, $1 comes back to Western Australia. You talked about a dike. We have a rabbit-proof fence in Western Australia, and it keeps starlings and Victorians out. But unfortunately, it keeps the fiscal flow from the Commonwealth to the state out as well. And at the moment, we seem to have a very clear crisis in the state public mental health system, and psychiatrists are very much at the sharp end of that. And so a lot of the discussion tonight, a lot of the lessons learned, both from what Pat has to say about the challenges that face our profession, but also our sector, and what Ken's had to say about how to upscale, or as I think Ken and I would both remember Bracken Steel, the good things, but not the bad things from the US are important things for us to take away from tonight. Can I ask you to all join with me in thanking Pat and Ken for their marvellous contributions. I know they can be around for a little while to take questions tonight, but in particular over the next couple of days for those of you who are coming to the rest of TheMHS. And then finally, if I can once again thank Viv and Alan in particular for the idea, but also helping translate it into action. And my thanks also to Rod and Warwick as co-conveners, and also Anne White, who I forgot to acknowledge, who was here today. And then to Ash and Steph, who've really put the event together today. And to Scott and Aldo, who've filmed this, for pulling it all together. So thanks to everybody else involved in bringing today to a conclusion. Thank you.